morning, Warsaw. Today is Tuesday, 12th September. It will be cloudy with highs of 19 degrees Celsius or 66 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:21 a.m. and sunset at 7:15 p.m. We are on the 43rd day of the Warsaw Uprising and water is becoming really scarce, isn't it, Alina?
Water is becoming scarce, but Claire's going to tell us a little bit more about that later. But let's come back to what is happening in Śródmieście, or the Midtown district of Warsaw. So the Germans are now intensifying their attacks on Czerniaków, specifically the northern part, and they do a large air bombardment. So a load of Stukas bomb the area, and straight after that, a lot of artillery fire begins from all directions, hitting the area. There are also infantry attacks, which are being directed towards the northern part. And on Czerniakowska Street, the Germans go back to their old ways, especially during the beginning. I mean, this never really stopped during the uprising, but on this specific day, the Germans are using the civilian population as shields, cover for their tanks, so that the insurgents don't shoot at their artillery, and they're able to get through barricades and capture buildings much easier. And this is a very difficult situation for the for the civilians too, obviously, for being stuck in the middle, but the insurgents have to make a choice. Do they shoot at innocent people, and these are predominantly women and children and the elderly that are being used, or do they allow the Germans to advance and kill them instead? So it's a Sophie's choice, really. Catch-22. Where would you go? The commander of the Kryszka group, Zygmunt Netzler, is seriously wounded. He's evacuated by the 20th of December by the Polish soldiers of the First Army, so the Soviet army, to the right bank of the river Vistula. And what's really interesting is that after the evacuation from Czerniaków, because that's where he's being evacuated from, to the Praga district, he's being treated in various different military hospitals all around Poland, and he finally manages to return back to Warsaw in September of 1945 as a disabled veteran. So this is a common story in many insurgents, those who survived and those who didn't die in prisoner of war camps or in forced labour. Some of them would have ended up as disabled veterans from the wounds that they sustained during the uprising. Anyway, coming back to the northern part of Śródmieście, there's another attack by the Germans towards Nowy Świat, so New World Street, at 6 a.m. The insurgents managed to capture and hold another house, another tenement building, but due to the enemy fire, the attack didn't quite achieve its intended goal. But also on the same day, the offensive began to shift to the side of the insurgents, so it is shifting positively for the insurgents, but also negatively at the same time. So it is proving still to be a difficult battle on day 43, so the 12th of September. Komorowski, the commander of the Home Army, reports that Soviet attacks on Praga, quote, seem to be successful. Soviet aviation has the advantage. There's no ammunition, and there's fear that we may not be able to survive just before the finish line. However, ammunition assistance is necessary. Which brings us nicely to what's going on in Żoliborz with the Soviets and the People's Home Army. Roger, where are we with that?
Yeah, there are some developing contacts at this point between the Soviets on the eastern bank in Praga, on the east bank of the Vistula, and the communist AL, the Armia Ludowa, which is one of those underground groupings, but as you'll remember, the communist-oriented one, which was fighting alongside the AK to a great extent within Warsaw. But as I said, was sort of communist-orientated. And they had already the day before, they'd sent a couple of messengers across the Vistula to make contact with the Soviets, and two more were sent on the night of the 12th of September. And one of those two, whose name was Janina Balcerzak, whose code name was Eva, they swam across the Vistula, which is no mean feat. In summer, it's probably at fairly low ebb, but still no mean feat, because it's quite a hefty river, those that know it. And they swam across to the east bank of the Vistula, where they're met by representatives of the Red Army, and they were taken to see Marshal Rokossowski, who was the commander in that district. So it's an important sort of first contact really between those two elements. Obviously sympathetic, obviously working towards a Soviet victory, and interestingly, that messenger pseudonym Eva Janina Baldserjak, she would later become a sort of prominent propaganda mouthpiece for Soviet propaganda through the underground. So quite a significant kind of contact is made on this day.
So, as you said, crossing the Vistula River was no mean feat, partly because it's a very mighty river. But of course, it's also in a war zone. And we know that the Germans have snipers actually shooting into anyone that they see attempting to cross a river in either direction at this point. And that becomes even more significant because water is increasingly becoming a very crucial issue. Already, we know that the pumping stations have gone, that people have been digging wells across the city, just a sort of private supply of water. And by this point, by mid-September, the Home Army Command has already let everyone in Warsaw know that they can only collect water during a few hours in the evening. And so people are going down with whatever containers they've got, just trying to fill it up and bring it back to their cellars for another day for their families, but also the fighters as well, of course. But now everyone is told that the water level has become critically low across the city. So now the Home Army announces very few, even greater limits on the hours when people can go out to collect water for themselves. And this is causing huge amounts of problems. I mean, there just isn't enough water to sustain everyone. There certainly isn't enough water for fire putting out duty. All of those fire pools that have been created early on in the war, they are now dry. And buildings, when they're hit or during incendiary raids or just during the fighting, street-to-street fighting now, and buildings are going up in flames and people around can't put those flames out. So there's increasing number of deaths in burning buildings because of this. But also just the obvious problem that people don't have enough to drink themselves personally. So what you get are people coming out of their houses at night, trying to make as much use as they can of the cover of darkness and going down to the river to try and get river water to drink, to boil at home if they can and to drink. And that's where the German snipers come in. They recognise this is going on and they start taking pot shots at everyone. So it's a really, truly desperate situation.
It's quite interesting. It's quite interesting that the sort of role played by the river is kind of significant. I think we often assume, and this was certainly my assumption, was that, in a sense, the river is sort of the front line, that the Soviets arrive on the eastern bank and sort of sit there. The Germans withdrew initially to the western side of the river and kind of sat there, and that became almost like a de facto front line. That's not really the case, which is quite an interesting thing, because it's, to me, if you think even with a modicum, the tiniest bit of strategic thinking, you'd think that the Germans would want to hold the line of the river. It'd be a relatively, obvious defensive line. But, the Germans still, even now, when we're talking about 12th of September, so we're sort of 6 weeks in to the Rising, and the Germans at this point still have troops on the eastern side of the river in Praga, so they are still fighting the Soviets. I mean, the advance obviously has slowed. The intensity of that Soviet approach has slowed dramatically since earlier in the summer, but there are still German troops there. And it's quite interesting if you look at the combat diary of the Ninth Army, which we've looked at a few times over this podcast. They're now sort of flagging up the fact that resistance on the eastern side of the river is now flagging. And it says, from the course of the fighting on the east bank of the Vistula, it says, it would appear that the front will reach the Vistula in a short time. And as we know, it's only a couple of days away before that actually happens. From this point of view, the diary says, all our progress in Warsaw may be meaningless, since the enemy will be able to cross larger forces and organise a bridge that will not be able to be eliminated by our forces. So you can see that this, from the German perspective, this prospect would be a game changer, to actually have the Soviets on, controlling the eastern frontier, and from there ready to move en masse towards the western side of the river, is potentially a game changer. So it's interesting how significant the river has become, and how it was a significance that maybe we assumed it had right from day one, but actually it kind of didn't. But it's assuming that significance now.
And the question of the bridges over the Vistula, who controls those, that becomes very important over the next few days, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. As the last of German forces in the east are presumably trying to execute a fighting withdrawal across those very same bridges.
But we've been talking a lot about what's happening on the ground, the issues with the bridges, but there's also something else that's really interesting that happens on this day. And Roger, I know you really want to talk about it because it's all about Erich von den Bach. And today is quite important for him, isn't it?
Yes, Erich von den Bach was the SS commander, ultimately responsible for the massacres at Wola and Chota. earlier in the Rising, and he was awarded with the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, which is a very high award. This is the one that you see many contemporary pictures of sort of German generals and so on, senior commanders. It's a large iron cross that used to be worn at the throat, and he was awarded with this. And the citation read, "For personal bravery and successes in command in the fight for Warsaw." If we're going to be honest about it, it's essentially been awarded for murdering Poles. It's rather gruesome, but there we are. So Erich von der Bach, awarded this high award on the 12th of September.
Thank you so much for joining us for day 43. Please join us tomorrow for day 44. Remember, if you like us, then feel free to leave us that 5-star review. And it's great that you guys are all listening. Thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow.